Hey, this is Kahja Elliott, Bronx born and raised, ATL made, Bay Area becoming, and this is the As Told By podcast. All right, we're back with a new episode of the As Told By podcast. This is actually going to be episode 1 of our new season.
Oh.
So we are back with a new season of the As Told By podcast. I'm Kahja Elliott, host of the As Told By podcast, and I am so excited for this conversation today. So let me jump very quickly to intros so we can get into it. I'm talking today to Crystal Wilkinson, who's a recent fellowship recipient of the Academy of American Poets and the award-winning author of Praisesong for the Kitchen Ghosts, a culinary memoir. Perfect Black, a collection of poems, and 3 works of fiction, The Birds of Opulence, Water Street, and Blackberries. She is the recipient of an NAACP Image Award for Outstanding Poetry, an O. Henry Prize, a USA Artist Fellowship, and an Ernest J. Gaines Prize for Literary Excellence, with recognition from the Yaddo Foundation, Hedgebrook, the Vermont Studio Center for the Arts, the Hermitage Foundation, and others. Her short stories, poems, and essays have appeared in numerous journals and anthologies, including most recently in The Atlantic, The Kenyon Review, Story, Agni Literary Journal, Emergence, Oxford American, and Southern Cultures. She was Poet Laureate of Kentucky from 2021 to 2023 and currently teaches creative writing at the University of Kentucky, where she is a Bush-Holbrook Endowed Professor. Welcome, Crystal.
Thank you for having me.
The rundown. Yes. I'm so glad to talk to you. I mentioned that you have just recently released a book, Praisesong for the Kitchen Ghosts, which I had an opportunity to read and love.
Oh, thank you.
Yes. So just to start off, I first became familiar with you through the program that debuted on Hulu last year, Searching for Soul Food. Mm-hmm. And on that show, there was an episode that focused on the history of food culture in Appalachia. And like a lot of people, first of all, I had no clue about the huge presence and culture and history of Black people in that region. But I also found I personally had a limited perspective of what area actually constitutes Appalachia. So let's start there. Talk about what area of the country we're talking about when we say Appalachia.
Well, I mean, it's surrounded. That's even hard for me because you know, if you pull out a map geographically, there are really 2. Like if you just follow the Appalachian Mountains, then you don't get the full story of the geography of the region. You know, on top of the region itself, which is mostly mountains, there's also people who live in the foothills. There are urban Appalachians. There are the foothills is where I grew up, and then there's another whole range of people and counties as defined by the Appalachian Regional Council, which started, years ago with, I think, President Truman. So, in addition, I think, to geography, it's defined by other things as well. So where I'm from is actually the foothills.
Okay. Foothills girl.
Yeah.
Okay. I felt like I learned so much watching that episode, not just about food, but also about the culture and the history of a community. So first, thank you for highlighting. Right? What a gift a lot of us got to even know that this is a region that we want to be learning about, need to be learning about, and that has a history that's very important. Mm-hmm. Yeah.
Thank you.
The pandemic, I noticed, is the backdrop for this book, right? So, you know, for so many of us, that was a time of reexamination. I know when I look back at that time, it's a little bit of a mixed bag because you have this somberness, right, about all of the loss that was happening during that time. But I also look back and I remark at some of the tremendous growth that came from people simply having to stop moving and engage in community in a completely different way. So it sounds like that was the impetus for what happened with you, but is it? Or was it?
Yeah, I mean, I think it was. You know, it was as we were grieving all the thousands of people that were dying across the country, across the world, I think that made me also think about my family and who had gone. And like you said, those moments of silence. I was writing a book anyway, actually this book was sold during the pandemic. So I was in the process of thinking about these things. I'd written the essay already called Praisesong for the Kitchen Ghost. And because cooking was such a big part of that, like we watched TV to the end. Like I didn't know that there was an end.
Yes, we did.
We watched it to the very end. And then in addition to regular meals, I started cooking. Like my husband said, I might not die of COVID, but I'm going to die of what are you doing? Like I just went into a frenzy with the baking and cooking, everything from my childhood, from everything I could think of. So I do think that it was sort of steeped in grief in some ways, and the book sort of has that filtering of grief, which I think on the other side is healing. So perhaps the writing of it was sort of a search for healing through the ancestors and through the food.
Yeah, grief and love through remembering.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah,
mm-hmm.
yeah. I have a couple of friends who are so steeped in that subject matter of grief through remembering. So through reading their work, I was able to recognize it immediately in your book, because it's the thinnest line between grief and love, if any line at all.
Right.
Yeah, yeah. In reading the book, you talk in depth about the matriarchs in your family, going back several generations. I thought the story of Aggie of Color, who went on to be Aggie Wilkinson, was particularly interesting as it relates to her husband, Tarleton Wilkinson. Fascinating in terms of the logistics and the legalities that were a part of their union. So can you share a bit about that part of your family's origin story?
Yes, and it still fascinates me. And of course, I can find lots of information on Tarleton because he's white. He's my fourth great-grandfather, and Aggie is my fourth great-grandmother. And I think the only reason I can find her is because of her attachment to him. I believe that they were common law married, which was illegal at that time. He never married a white woman. He was always with Aggie. They had 10 children that were over and over again identified as mulattoes in census records. So I think it's an odd thing, and as a writer, I continue to be really drawn to it. Like, who their relationship. I found some other documents that I didn't really put into the book because I couldn't find anything on the other side of them. Like, there was a couple of legal situations that he ended up being in. It seemed like he had a fight over her.
Oh.
So, or I'm sure it was related to someone saying, "Oh, you married to this woman," or whatever, or it's illegal. And I think one of the reasons why he didn't go to jail by living in that situation was because his father was so connected, and I think because he was with this black woman, there was lots of white men with black women, as we know.
Yes, there were.
But for him not to have taken a white wife, I think was a big deal, like to the point that his father left him, I think, $2.
Okay. I mean, that's interesting because a lot of, like you said, the presence of white men with black women at that time is nothing new, but there was some coercion about it that didn't seem to be present in this situation.
Right.
Yeah.
Yeah. And I think it was unusual. I think he was an outcast from both his family and the community. And there's all kinds of complications for myself and in the history. Like, someone said, "Do you think he loved her?" And I said, "He owned her." Like, what kind of love is that?
Wow.
Maybe he thought he did. Maybe, I don't know. Like
that's
that.
An odd way.
Yeah, that continues to haunt me. But one of the most emotional things about this is that Aggie is my ancestor, Grandma Aggie, but she's sort of a stand-in for all of the thousands of black women that are not named from her time, that were in similar or worse situations. And I think that's what hit me most, like being able to, as a professor, as a black woman in this country, like knowing these things. We know what our history is. We know the trials and the tribulations of our history, but to actually like be able to put my finger on it, like to see it, like, oh, there it is. I have chills now just thinking about it. Like, there it is. Like, and it's changed my whole life, really, because I've never taken, probably telling too much of my business, but I've never taken any husband's last name because I'm such a proud Wilkinson.
Okay, I can see that. I can understand that.
Yeah, such a proud Wilkinson. But then, and we know that our people were unnamed, but then to be able to, again, like...
Put your hand on the record.
Yeah, put my hand on the record that this is where she was Aggie of color with no name. Maybe her name wasn't even Aggie.
Maybe that was some abbreviated name.
Maybe it was. Or, that's may not be what did her mother even have the privilege of naming her? Or did someone else? It just unlocked so much that I didn't go into because this book, the lens for this book is food, but it certainly has changed my life and continued to haunt me.
Yeah. It kind of set the tone for me as I read that part about the generations of women to come in your family. So Ma Lily, your great-grandmother, Grandma Christine, which is your grandmother, and then Dorsey, your mother, but mostly your grandmother Christine, who raised you and is your primary kitchen ghost. And seemingly, from what I could glean, the biggest influence in your life, it sounded like. And as I read your descriptions of her, she felt so familiar to me, and I'm sure to a lot of other people who read the book. How has it been to connect through her story with this broad audience of people who, like you, are remembering their own Christine?
I hoped that people would remember their own mothers, grandmothers, find out about their great-grandmothers. But it's been really wonderful and sometimes overwhelming. Like, I find myself just weeping with people all over the country, which is healing, I think, in some ways, for myself, through my grandmother, and for them, because that's the primary thing that people say. Reading this book made me think about my Big Mama, my grandmama,
my dear.
Mama dear, yes.
All those things, those people we know and love. I'll talk about that a bit in a moment, but as I've done the podcast and done different episodes, particularly with people who work in the food industry, almost every single person cites their grandmother as their influence.
Yes. And that's something special, right? Like, I think that we have a reverence for our grandmothers in particular. They are often the primary nurturers. Like, usually our mamas, whether they were in the situation of my mother or not, are like doing stuff. Like, they are the ones that are like, I got to go to work, go sit down, whatever, in a loving way, often, hopefully. But it's the grandmothers who really pay attention to us, that nurture us, that make sure we're fed. Like, even, I laugh about it now, but my grandmother, who my children had the privilege of meeting, she was all about feeding them. My girls are twins, and so when they were born, they were premature, so they're like, and they're naturally thin. but she would follow them around with bowls of food constantly. Just take a bite for Granny.
Oh, wow. Good. I'm going to come back to that in a moment, just with an observation I made around exactly what you described in reading this. But I do want to share just a quote that you stated in the book I thought was so beautiful. You said, "My grandmother nursed my fevers, kissed my bruises, encouraged my dreams. She filled first her pots and then our bellies in the same way that her mother and grandmothers have for generations, through slavery, through manumission, through the Great Depression, through wars, through poverty, through segregation, through the civil rights movement, through racism. Women of this ilk always find a way." Mm-hmm. She was of an ilk.
She was.
As you described, and as you went on to talk about your ancestors, there were some instances where there's an ancestral conjuring, if you will, mm-hmm, right? Or expressing of sorts of what their thoughts and experiences had been. With these women no longer here to give their own account, what was the importance for you of going within to give them that voice?
One, I think spiritually, I felt like I didn't have a choice. When Aggie came to me first in the research and then in sort of a spiritual way, she basically was saying, granddaughter, mm-hmm, fourth grade granddaughter, tell my story. Tell my story, and by telling my story, you'll be telling the stories of thousands of other Black women across this country. So I felt that really, really strongly. And so I felt it also important to use the tools available to me. I mean, I could have very easily wrote about her in sort of a third-person abstract way, but why not, after doing the research and knowing as much as I know, all the names that I use are names that I found in my research when I have her talking to Judah. Judah's a name that I found that was on, not really on the slave rolls, but one of the people that was involved in the white Wilkinson household and doing the work, mm-hmm, and as were the other names. So I thought that was a way to give her agency.
Yeah.
Like she had none, perhaps. I think that's why Tarleton deeded her those items from the house, because, she may have even said to him, I try to imagine that she said, you own me, you own my children, what do I own? And so being able to use the tools it gifted to me as a fiction writer, to let her stand up and tell her own story, was important and made me see, and I think part of a writer's job is to sort of hold something up to the light and sort of turn it around and examine it. And so by doing that, I was able to turn it around in a way and see something that I wouldn't have been able to see, mm-hmm, if I'd written it from a straight sort of research, historical reference point. And the same with my own grandmother. One of the most powerful things in the book for me was to think about my grandmother on the eve of her wedding. She was 14 years old when she got married.
Yeah, I saw that. I saw where you shared that.
Mm-hmm. And for me to not just write about her being that time, but let her step forward and sort of tell the story, or to get really close with that, with, again, the abilities gifted to me as a fiction writer to allow that scene to come alive, that separation from her mother at 14, mm-hmm, going into marriage and then bearing 7 children. And, she was 14. My grandfather was 18, I think. Such
a common occurrence just of the times, mm-hmm, that when you think of it now, it's mind-blowing.
Yes, yeah.
Yeah, wow. With the book primarily being based around family and food, I do want to pivot a bit to the food part of that. Mm-hmm. And farming and foraging played a huge role in your family's history and in the foodways in general of Appalachians, Black Appalachians, but Appalachians as a whole. Mm-hmm. even with the evolutions of industrialization, talk about the prevalence of farming in that community today.
As it is now. Yeah, I mean, I think we've lost all across the country, and particularly in that area too, since that's what I know, we've lost black farmers. A lot of people in my family didn't want to farm anymore. Like, it's such hard work, and especially if you, like my grandfather did, rely on it not just for the sustenance of your own family, but as a way to your primary way of making a living. It's devastating to have a year where it doesn't work out because of weather or blight or insects or some act of nature. So even the generation of my mother and her siblings, they all moved away to get jobs at IBM or Cincinnati, to get jobs at Procter & Gamble or wherever they got jobs, because they found a way to make money without, to work hard, but not to be out in the field all day with the idea that it might not work out that year. Then what do you do?
Yeah.
But I think what's happening now is that there's a resurgence. There certainly won't, I won't say ever, but I suspect that there won't be as many farmers as there once were. But I love the new black farmer. My cousins are the new black farmers. They have gone back and gotten seeds that our family had. And in my case, with the Miller farm, my cousin's wife has gotten seeds from her family. So those heirloom seeds, to bring those forth that have been in the family for generations, for George Allen to be on a tractor or to be plowing a field the way that both his father did and our grandfather did, I find it all really amazing. To be able to go and get a black CSA, to have a food basket from black farmers, to get meat from black butchers, to get milk from black dairy farmers, has been really amazing.
Yeah, I like you, I have loved, I don't come from a farming background, but I have loved seeing this surge in the last maybe 10 years, but really in the last 5, of black farmers, young people who, like you said, could very well opt into corporate careers or whatever. So I saw that Gabrielle Etienne interviewed you, or moderated, I should say, an earlier stop on the book tour, and Krista Barfield. And even here locally in Hayward, California, we have Brown Girl Farms. So this resurgence and this interest in getting back to the things that made us.
Yeah. And I think, what we miss sometimes because of what we went through, there for a while, even when I look at my children, there was a period of their lives where they said things like, go to a cabin in the woods. We black. I'm not going out there. Or, work in a field. I'm not doing that. But even my children, I see, are beginning to grow gardens. I can't say that they're farmers, but they're beginning to grow gardens and feel good about it. And I think it's important for us. I think nature is healing for black people. And so to see people going back out in it, and sometimes to raise their own food and create their own nutritional sustenance for themselves and their families, and then for other people, is just amazing.
Yeah.
And to teach children.
And to teach.
Yeah.
Keep it going.
Yeah.
Keep it going. When I read your recollection of Indian Creek, which is where you were as a young girl, I think of all of these rural communities that many of us were fortunate, whether we realized it or not at the time, were fortunate enough to spend time in as children with elder family members. And how we're at a place now where we've either migrated out of those communities, or we no longer have possession of the land or the property for whatever reason. And with the loss of these rooted places, due in part to like general expansion of opportunities for women, I find that I go back and forth with like a wistfulness and a gratefulness, right? Because it's many of these environments, for as much as they fed us literally and figuratively, they also created a lot of limitations for who our matriarchs may have been able to be.
Mm-hmm. I think that's true. You know, while I think my childhood was enchanted, I was always, and that's why I'm a professor now. I mean, I was always aware, and my grandmother always made sure that I was aware. Reading and writing was important in our household, even though my grandfather could not read. And she always wanted to be a school teacher. She wanted to be a teacher so bad, and her parents said, no, it's dangerous. And it was for many teachers of her era. Like, she would have had to move away from her family at 14, because that's when she just graduated from 8th grade, and then she would have had to go to another town, to the teacher's college, to learn how to be a teacher, and she just wasn't able to do it, so she got married, and so there was limitations. So she was always excited about whatever I was doing. Like, she was excited that I went to college, as she was excited about her other grandchildren that we, got out, so to speak, and still had reverence for our past. We didn't, as she used to say, get above our raisin.
Keep your roots in your back pocket.
Mm-hmm.
Yes. Thinking about the relation of how she saw that for you, you also talked about in the book being at a point a young single mother, navigating, lean times and food scarcity while trying to create the comfort and the familialness that you experienced around food for them as well. When you look back at those times, what do you remember most about that experience that you now are most grateful for?
I mean, I think my grandmother's all through this, and I loft her to sort of romantic, mythical realms. But I think I'm grateful that I did know what to do with scarcity, that my children never really went hungry. They may not have had what they wanted to eat, but I think because of my grandmother gave me the ability to make a way out of no way. Yeah. So if I had a few potatoes, whatever, sometimes the kids would look and go, is this dinner? And I'm like, yes, this is dinner. It's good. Eat it, that I had that ingenuity, like, okay, we don't have McDonald's money. We don't even have hamburger helper money, but we're going to take this.
We got some beans.
Yeah, we got some beans. I got some staples. So I got some flour, some cornmeal. I'm going to make some bread. We're going to have some beans, or I'm going to make some chili, whatever it was. Like, usually it was a one-pot meal when things got that scarce. And, they ate well. Like, again, it wasn't McDonald's. It may not have been what they wanted, but I had the skills to throw it together and make it taste good. And
make it happen.
Yeah.
I laughed at a point in reading because I don't know why I'm such a huge fan of Jiffy products. And I was like, I felt shamed at a point, like, girl, make your own cornbread. Jiffy has a time and a place. It was so funny. For Christmas, a really good friend of mine got me a complete box set of everything Jiffy ever made. And I was like, oh my God, it's the perfect gift. I'm going to challenge myself, though, to just do regular cornbread from scratch.
You can do it. You can do it from scratch.
I can.
And you can still make it, I won't get into a regional fight about sugar in the cornbread, because I don't think there should be any. But if you want it sweet, you can make it from scratch and put in as much sugar till your heart's content.
Put your little sugar. Go right on. Y'all heard it. I have all the ingredients. I'm going to make my own cornbread from scratch. We will revisit Jiffy at a later time. Your daughters, you mentioned you have twin daughters, and they are probably, correct me if I'm wrong, but the first generation of women in your family with complete choice around how much they want to engage in, what we'll call, quote unquote, traditional domestic tasks like cooking. I think that we are the generation that could kind of opt in or opt out. We had exposure to it through our grandparents. And then as we moved on in our lives, we could choose whether or not we wanted to stay there. But do you think that the legacy is in keeping the traditions unchanged or in having the freedom to change them?
I think the legacy is in having the freedom. I had to grapple with it. You've read the book, like I grappled with it. I still kind of put my hand on my hip and grapple with it a little bit. But, as a feminist, as a woman of these times, more power to them if they do not want to do it, and more power to them if they want to, dive in. One thing about my girls that I thought was hilarious is that they grew all this food, and then they didn't know what to do with. Like, what am I going to do with this? I'm struggling as someone who grew up in it and knows how to do it. I am laboring over my tomatoes in my backyard. I am just like, oh my God, they're all dying. This is not working. And, I'm asking them, like, have you checked on your tomatoes? My daughter said, I ain't looked at them tomatoes for 2 weeks. And then she goes out there and has an abundance, like has buckets and buckets of tomatoes. Ain't even trying. And then she's like, they're going to rot. What am I going to do with them? And I'm like, girl. But I love that they have the choice. And I love, one of my girls said, maybe I won't completely give up on this. I'll pick one or two things.
Okay.
And I said, okay.
We'll take something.
Yeah. All right. And, find something else. Like, I leaned into the cooking. But there are they have other choices. They have other things to lean into, even for tradition, if they want to.
Yeah. All kinds of ways to approach tradition as well. Yeah. A lot of ways to keep that going. With our food traditions now being in so many ways center stage, right? It's been interesting to me to see the evolution of how this shows up in restaurant culture and to see these variations or just like outright representations of food that we know originated with poor Black folks appearing in fine dining spaces when for many years Black people weren't even part of that equation. What are your thoughts on the recent emergence of Black chefs who are able to create these high-end dining experiences that are still deeply rooted in Black foodways?
Ooh, girl. No, seriously. I mean, I have two. I come from that from two different perspectives. Like one of them is that I find innovation interesting. That you can have somebody who was French trained that comes back and it's like, oh, these are greens, blah blah blah, whatever they call them, and in a way that is also paying honor and homage to their upbringing, and I think I'm okay with it to a certain extent. So much of our culture has been stolen already, so I am all for particularly Black chefs. It's like, yeah, I'm gonna take my mama's specialty or my grandmother's specialty and turn it into something, and present it in this 5-star restaurant. And the same thing is happening. We're talking about, my Black Appalachian culture versus Appalachian culture, and a lot of that is happening too. Like my grandparents had pawpaws. There's I guess it's a fruit from a pawpaw tree that grows wild. And I was in a restaurant recently, and they were putting pawpaw sauce on something, and I was like, is this pawpaw the fruit? Huh? What's going on here?
Yeah.
And the same thing with ramps and a lot of creasy greens, which are like watercress now, and those kind of things that were foraged. Fiddleheads you'll find in restaurants sometimes.
I learned about those just here in the book. Yeah.
So, I kind of, in some ways, like seeing those things sort of lofted up, but I hope that someone is also protecting, particularly the foraged items. Like, some things are hard to find. So unless people are growing them sort of commercially and then putting them in their restaurants, there's a fear of people running around there are certain things that only grow. Like ramps are only there a small period of time during the year. Like our ancestors to use those because it was spring and they needed something fresh and green as the snow was melting, and they were craving fresh foods, like not just because they haven't had them, but nutritionally. Like they foraged because they, like my auntie said, because when I asked Aunt Lo, my auntie, who just turned, she's 87 now.
Amen.
I said, well, Aunt Lo, did you like all those things that y'all foraged for? She said, eat it or die.
Wow.
Eat it or die.
It came down to that.
It came down to that. So, it's one thing to go pick poke or dandelion greens because you have to. It's yet another thing to go pick poke or wild dandelion greens because you want to reach back. But then it's another whole thing if you are trying to feed, keep your restaurant in business and you want to put these things on your menu. Like, where are you sourcing them from? Is what I'm always interested in. I haven't looked into those, but I'm always interested in that. Like, are you being responsible when you're sourcing these things?
Bringing people along in that journey in the right ways.
Yes.
Yeah. Yeah. It's interesting you say that because I had my first exposure to ramps, like in an elevated dining experience. I was not familiar with them. I was in New York at the time, and it was maybe late April, early May, and they were in the farmer's market. I had not heard of them. I hadn't had them either. Loved them. I had them grilled. But then coming back to California, looking for them in our farmer's market and asking and people not even knowing what it was.
Yeah.
I didn't even realize because it was shortly thereafter that Searching for Soul Food debuted, and there was the history. And I'm like, this is why they don't know. This is a complete regional, very seasonal, item that you're not going to find outside of a certain locality and definitely not outside of a certain time of year. So, in seeing that on menus to follow, I kind of had some of the same thoughts you had about, how you have access to this and we're all the way over here. How do you even, source or, get access to this to serve on any elevated level or any, mass level, like in a restaurant setting. So I hear what you're saying in that regard.
Well, and I hope some local people are getting the come up. Like, I hope there's somebody somewhere, like, finding a way to, instead of, like everything else, somebody going into the woods and just taking everything for their restaurant so there's nothing left for the local folks. But, I don't know. I have not researched that. That is the hope.
Yeah. Well, I'll tell you, ramps have not made their way to Bay Area farmers markets. I know. I've checked.
Are pawpaws there?
Pawpaws are not there. I had not heard of them, and certainly not fiddleheads. I learned of that in the book. So, but that, to me, that's the fun of this kind of thing, is as you move around regionally, and as I move around regionally, farmers markets and just markets in general are always someplace I try to stop because there's such an education there on things that you just don't have access to everywhere.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Yeah. And it's kind of fun, though. My cousin who grew up in the area said that she was at a fancy restaurant and she said she had watercress, something or another, and she's like, this ain't nothing but, she's a very sort of refined woman, but she switched into the old way. She's like, this ain't nothing but some greasy greens.
Call it when you see it. You wrote about finding a sort of a ritualistic peace in, simple tasks during the pandemic, like grocery delivery and meal planning. And it made me think about all of these food-based businesses that started during the pandemic that were based in practices like canning and baking, right? Mm-hmm. The old things that we got away from. And, for as much as I love the experience of dining out, I really, really love how we all became reconnected to these simpler expressions of food during the pandemic. I know you talked about your family having, extensive experience around canning, not necessarily for business purposes, but to be able to preserve food over the course of seasons.
Right. Yeah. Yeah. I mean, I think canning, that's one of the differences. People always talk about what the difference, or is there a difference, is always the question. Is there a difference between Appalachian food and the food of the Deep South? And I think that idea of preservation is one of the distinguishing, one of the things that distinguish, because, you couldn't grow foods all winter in Appalachia. You just could not have a lot of people in the Deep South have winter gardens where they put out, their collards, or they put out other things that will be, a little hardy, but you couldn't grow anything in a good Appalachian winter. So the idea was to preserve it. Like you put up the hams and you put up the salt pork, you canned things, you laid out the green beans and dried them out so that you would have some green beans in the winter if you didn't can them. So, it's been interesting to see a lot of organizations that are teaching people how to can now. I feel like I need to go to one of those classes because it's been a long time. But so it's very heartwarming for me to see, like, young people saying, I had an event a couple of weeks ago in Kentucky, and a young woman bounced up and gave me a jar of canned green tomatoes that she had made. And I was like, and she told me about it. She's farms. And I was like, oh, look at that.
Yes.
So she's doing the ways of her people and carrying it forward.
Yeah. I've just recently, in the last few months, took a liking to pickling things. I hadn't made my way to canning. I'm not sure if I will, but pickling is so much fun for me. And there's so many things. As you use things and you have odds and ends and tips and pieces, and to not throw them away, but to transform them into things that you can pull out of your cabinet 6 months, even sometimes a year later, and have use of it.
Yeah.
Yeah. Going back to the ways of the people. Yes. I'll wrap us up, but, with one final question, I'll ask you, what do you think Aggie and Christine would think of your life today?
I would hope that they would be proud, and proud is such a cliched word, but, I think that they would be, like, surprised, like, look at that girl we made, like, look at her. And she's talking about us, too. Like, I hope that they would be proud, and they would get some satisfaction in that I'm able to do things that they couldn't do during their times. Particularly my grandmother, the fact that I'm a teacher, I know that she would be so proud that I'm a professor because she wanted to be a teacher so badly. And Aggie, I think, one day I might write a novel about her so that I can be more expansive in trying to explore what she may have been thinking. But I think that she would be happy that I have agency.
Yeah. I can see that. I can see that. That takes me perfectly to a quote I want to share from the book that I think touches on what you said perfectly. You say, I have the privilege of education, of making a living from my mind and not my domestic labor in a white woman's kitchen. I cook out of homage for pleasure and not by bound duty. I am keenly aware that Black Appalachian foodways are a legacy to be treasured, to be passed on to the next and the next and the next. I'm thankful that my children and grandchildren will find their own ways to morph and change culinary traditions, to add to and subtract from their mothers' ways, to honor the calling of the kitchen ghosts, however they see fit. So I have to tell you that I really have loved reading this book. I absolutely will be making some of the recipes. It's interesting in that it's a book that you read in the traditional sense, but there are also recipes, family photos interspersed throughout. So it really is. I think I read somewhere where you said you take it from the nightstand to the kitchen because it's applicable in both places. I will tell you that in reading this, the biggest takeaway for me, I'm a fairly new grandmother. I have a 17-month-old granddaughter.
Congratulations.
Thank you. Hey, baby Soleil. But it was so, like, it just kind of hit me out of nowhere that I'm in position to be someone's kitchen ghost. And the responsibility of that in the best way, right? The responsibility of what that comes with and the place that I'm in position to hold in the heart and mind and life of a woman to come.
Yes.
So thank you so much for this. This will have happened by the time this episode airs, but you will be at Omnivore Books this evening doing a reading and a signing. I had not been to Omnivore Books before. Shockingly, I did not know it was a bookstore that was just cookbooks. So I think I'm going to come a little early to peruse and then be there right on time for the book talk. I'm so excited to hear what you have to say there as well. But I want to thank you so much for taking the time to talk with me today.
Of course. Thank you.
Yes. And then share with people where they can find information about you and about Praisesong for the Kitchen Ghosts.
So Praisesong for the Kitchen Ghost is available wherever books are sold. If you buy books online or your favorite bookstore, you should be able to get it. If they don't have it, have them order it. And as far as me, my website is crystalewilkinson.net. And then I'm on all the socials as Crystal Wilkie. So Instagram, Facebook,
yes,
X, all those other places.
All the things.
The things.
I will make sure I will include all of that information with the show notes. And thank you so much for making San Francisco part of your book tour stop. If you want to learn a little bit more about me in between episodes, you can find me on Instagram at Hey K in the Bay. That is this week's episode of the As Told by podcast. Peace.